Did you know that black female slaves were used as wet nurses too? Yes, you heard right. They were. Since slavery, the dehumanization of black people has been entrenched deeply in the social pyramid. One such is the tragic case of black enslaved mothers who were forced to breastfeed their owners' children at the expense of theirs. History has it that the practice of having black lactating mothers breastfeed white kids originated in the 1600s when malaria claimed numerous lives of many white settlers. The slave owners believed that feeding their babies with milk from their native slaves would provide them with natural immunity towards malaria. This had a trickle-down impact on not only racial, but also the psychological, financial, and political fabric of the society throughout the black community. The plight of enslaved black wet nurses is a heart-wrenching chapter in history. Stripped of autonomy over their bodies, they were treated as commodities.
Stop trying to sell your courses or coaching programs at the end of a webinar. There's a new way, a better way. It's called the No.
History has it that wives of slave owners timed their pregnancies with that of their slaves and then forcefully separated enslaved new mothers from their infants to serve as wet nurses for their own children. Enslaved black mothers were often beaten up and treated harshly to ensure compliance in feeding the babies of white slave masters. These slaves were sometimes milked like cows to feed white babies. The cruel treatment, coupled with the emotional trauma of being separated from their own children, led to a distorted image of black mothers as unloving and harsh, a stereotype perpetuated by slave owners to justify their inhumane practices. What didn't these slaveholders do that is called evil? What experiment didn't they try on people of color when it comes to the talk about slavery? In this video, we are examining the lives of black female slave wet nurses and the untold traumas they endured at the hands of their slave masters. Before we continue, don't forget to support our works by hitting that like button in front of you, share with your friends and families to keep spreading our eye-opening black narrative, and subscribe to stay on for more while you as well help the channel grow. Your support means a whole lot to us. Let us proceed. A deep dive into this dark history exposes how black mothers were systemically deprived of breastfeeding their own children to nourish that of their white counterparts. It shouldn't be commonized in any way when that black woman is not allowed to have any authority, not even over her own body, because of her blackness. When she cannot be allowed to breastfeed even her own tender baby because she must breastfeed the white baby with it. And then she'd watch her lovely child die because she wasn't there for it, even though she was there. Nothing can be more traumatic. There is no telling the sorrows these black female slaves go through as wet nurses in the hands of their enslavers. A woman who breastfeeds and cares for another's child is a wet nurse. Wet nurses are employed if the mother dies, or if she is unable or chooses not to nurse the child herself. Wet nursing existed in cultures around the world until the invention of reliable formula milk in the 20th century, although it is said that this practice has made a small comeback in the 21st century. But come to think of it, if you do not want or like to breastfeed the child, why put it to birth in the first place? While considerations in this subject persist, there are many reasons why the service of a wet nurse is employed. But the most common amongst them, especially during the dark ages of slavery, is simple. Most women chose not to breastfeed for all kinds of social reasons. The kind of reasons one is compelled to consider rather bizarre and unnatural. Let's look at it. For upper-class women, breastfeeding was considered unfashionable in the sense that it not only prevented them from being able to wear the fashionable clothing of their time, but it was also thought to ruin their figures. Working women faced other pressures to abandon breastfeeding, including from their husbands. Hiring a wet nurse was less expensive than having to hire someone else to help run the family business and take care of the family household duties in their place. Also, some women chose to hire wet nurses purely to escape from the confining and time-consuming chore of breastfeeding. This use of enslaved women as wet nurses caused a great deal of debate among Southerners. Many slaveholding women did not even see nursing their children as part of their normal responsibilities as mothers. Other women, however, did look upon this practice with a skeptical and critical eye. In one woman's judgment, that woman is but half a mother who does not suckle her own children. Sickening as hell as this sounds, the invaluable breast milk of the black female slave, often referred to as liquid gold in this era, solely benefited the children of white slaveholders. being singularly devoted to their nourishment most of the time. And because these slaves were so consumed with feeding white babies to the point of exhaustion, they often gave cow milk or goat milk or even dirty water as substitutes to their own babies. This resulted in the high death rates of babies of slaves and susceptibility to diseases in the early childhood of black children. Enslaved women, acting as wet nurses, were traumatized immensely due to the conditions they were exposed to unceasingly. First, they are used as breeders to make more slaves for their masters, conceiving their babies through all kinds of sexual abuses. And then after they put to birth, they're not allowed the space to even breastfeed their newborns. It is a maddening state, a plight dimming and devastating enough to shape the psyche of the enslaved, rippling through their generations. Enslaved slave women were only allowed 1 or 2 months at most away from their duties before their masters required them to return to work, leaving their children with another slave. Being deprived of time with their own children, enslaved women must have resented time with their slave masters' children. In Stephen Firth Ash's book, A Year in the South, 1865, he describes how Matilda Hughes, an enslaved woman, had to work so much that her twins died because she was unable to breastfeed them often enough. If enslaved women's children died of neglect, how must they have felt when coerced to breastfeed their owners' children? Reluctant slaves were beaten and often milked like cows to feed white babies. Whether you surrendered or not, the choice wasn't yours to make. The authority isn't yours to command. You are yourself a property. Many slave owners practiced wet nursing as a form of birth control among black slaves. In that era, having an heir and a spare was a common practice among the wealthy and affluent. Relegating the nursing duties to a black mother freed up the white mothers for giving birth to the next progeny. However, nursing and raising white children did not protect black women from cruelty. Some nurses did benefit by escaping the field labor to live in the houses. The cruelty was, however, perpetuated psychologically. In 1912, as seen on historian Kamna Kurdi's Medium page, a black nurse living in Georgia described her duties thus: "I live a treadmill life, and I see my own children only when they happen to see me on the streets when I am out with the children, or when my children come to the yard to see me. Which isn't often because my white folks don't like to see their servants' children hanging around their premises." Although wet nursing existed for many centuries, most times due to medical-related issues, in history, only slave mothers who were black were forced into the act. It was mandated at some point by slave owners that only one breast could be used to feed the white child. If she happens to switch and let both black and white babies suckle from the same breast, she would be whipped, because it was seen as the same as letting them share from the same water fountain. While much attention is paid to the masculinized enslaved, white women's reliance on and exploitation of black women is often overlooked. The extent to which white women had commodified black wet nurses' labor can be seen in how they've reacted so far to this emotional distress. Instead of trying to improve conditions for enslaved wet nurses, white women typically use their wet nurses' despair as an excuse to sell them, noting in advertisements to other prospective buyers that this particular wet nurse was prone to the sulks or madness, lessening her value. Before the Civil War, white female enslavers commonly found breastfeeding to be unfashionable and inconvenient. Instead, they preferred to have black enslaved wet nurses breastfeed their babies. These wet nurses were a valuable commodity. In 1850, 20% of white enslavers, that is about 70,000, relied on them to breastfeed their children. While wet nursing was a global and ancient practice for enslaved African women, it was dehumanizing.
Stop paying for investment courses led by these so-called gurus charging you thousands of dollars for advice that doesn't
and traumatic, stripping them of autonomy over their own breasts. The problem with wet nursing is it's a very exploitative custom. Historically, Jacqueline Wolfe, a professor in the Department of Social Medicine at Ohio University, tells Yahoo Life. Wolfe's research focuses on the history of birth and breastfeeding practices in the U.S., and she explains that the early U.S. practice of hiring wet nurses was based on class and imported from the English custom. In the 19th century, wealthier women were thought of as weaker, and it was considered inappropriate for them to overtax themselves by breastfeeding, so poorer rural women were often hired to do the job. But Wolf says, for the women they employed, it was an occupation born of desperation. Women who worked as wet nurses were desperate, she says. They were almost exclusively single women who had been abandoned by their families because of the shame of being single mothers, or women who were widowed and homeless. Wealthy families would find a wet nurse by posting help-wanted ads in newspapers, or through their doctor. The cruel language used in these ads, Wolf says, paints a picture of just how poorly wet nurses were regarded, with many employers describing them as inherently immoral and as a terrible burden on the families that sheltered them. And doctors were even uglier about how they talked about wet nurses, Wolf says. One quote was describing wet nurses as 3/4 cow and 1/4 devil. Once they were employed, most wet nurses were forced to part with their own baby, whom they might never see alive again. It just was unheard of for an upper-class family, or even an upper-middle-class family, to permit a wet nurse to bring her own baby into the home, because the thought was, I'm paying you. I want attention paid to my baby, Wolf explains. So the wet nurses had to give their own babies over to foundling homes, and the death rate in the foundling homes was appalling, close to 100%. So literally, the wet nurse would save the life of a wealthy baby at the expense of her own child. This cruel practice also had devastating effects on the health of enslaved children. Black mothers were physically separated from their own newborns to breastfeed their enslavers' babies, sometimes permanently. Legal scholar Andrea Freeman has argued that the stereotype of the bad black mother helped justify this inhumane practice. A key pillar of this idea, she writes, was the racist caricature of the mammy, a black enslaved woman who was, as Enslaved Women in America, an encyclopedia puts it, devoted to mothering white children, but who neglected her own. Little is known of whether the deprivation of black children from their mother's milk at birth affected them negatively or otherwise. However, one of the descendants of these mothers was heard saying that the babies of enslaved wet nurses were bottle-fed a concoction of dry milk and dirty water that was not a healthy alternative to breastfeeding. As a result, many black babies died during slavery, which led to the disruption of the mother-child relationship, creating anguish and guilt for black mothers and distress for their babies. Even when enslaved black women who were not wet nurses breastfed, they did so for far shorter lengths of time than their counterparts in Africa, commonly nursing for only 1 year instead of 2 or 3, because enslavers wanted mothers to take as little time off from labor as possible. After slavery ended, some black women continued to serve as wet nurses for white families, exposing them to further exploitation. Black families faced major economic barriers from centuries of exploitation and discriminatory laws, which forced black women back to work after giving birth, often making breastfeeding impossible. The fact that black women breastfeed less than other mothers has served varying white interests throughout history, Freeman further uncovers. These included making black women available to perform exploitative labor for whites. When infant formula based on evaporated milk became widely endorsed by both parents and physicians in the 1940s, white interests remained the priority. Formula companies targeted black women in their ads, leading to enormous profits for the white-run industry. As Freeman has shown in her book Skimmed Breastfeeding, Race and Injustice and Other Scholarship, the first black children shown in infant formula advertisements were the Fultz quadruplets, black Cherokee sisters born in 1946, who quickly became famous as the first recorded African-American identical quadruplets. A white doctor, Fred Klenner, delivered them and quickly moved to capitalize on their fame for his own benefit. Among other things, he signed them on as poster children for the St. Louis Pet Milk Company. Klenner's exploitation resulted in a chain of events that cost the Fultz parents custody of the quadruplets, who went on to face poverty, isolation, and early deaths. While formula companies targeted black women with ads featuring black children, the 1950s marked a surge in the popularity of breastfeeding among privileged white women with the rise of breastfeeding organizations such as La Leche League, founded in 1956. These white-led organizations centered their advocacy for breastfeeding on white women, largely excluding black women. Alongside this white-centered breastfeeding movement, popular media began to portray predominantly white women breastfeeding in humanizing images, helping to normalize white mothers breastfeeding. By contrast, Freeman writes, Positive images of black women breastfeeding remained virtually non-existent. Magazines such as National Geographic portrayed breastfeeding black women as exotic and savage. This difference in portrayals was built on racist ideas about black mothers that dated to the idea of the mammy. After slavery, as Freeman notes, the mammy character evolved to take many forms from Aunt Jemima,
If you want to get ahead in the game, the best way to quickly and easily make $10,000 per month in passive income,
humanizing mascot for syrup that was recently discontinued, to the welfare queen, a figure who, according to Ronald Reagan's rhetoric, reproduced only to game the system by deriving more government benefits. Popular movies and television shows also perpetuated these racist stereotypes of the bad black mother, helping to push black mothers away from breastfeeding because society associated the practice with good white mothers. This stereotype sends messages about black motherhood that black women and their families internalize. In addition to media influence, several key pieces of legislation also pressured black women to formula feed. First, the Special Supplemental Nutrition Program for Women, Infants, and Children, WIC, launched in 1974. Black women were less likely to receive breastfeeding support from WIC compared to white women, implying that WIC staff assumed black women would formula feed. All the while, the program also offered free formula to low-income women, further incentivizing its adoption. Second, the United States did not sign on to the World Health Organization's International Code of Marketing Breast Milk Substitutes in 1981 because of concerns about the World Health Organization, WHO, becoming involved in U.S. commercial marketing. This refusal enabled formula companies to continue printing and airing unrestricted advertisements, often targeted at black communities, despite evidence that it hurt women and babies by encouraging mothers to formula feed, sometimes offering free samples, when they could not afford it long-term. This led to some mothers feeding their babies inadequate amounts of milk because of lack of funds. Third, the 1996 changes to welfare, fueled by long-standing racist conceptions about welfare, forced new mothers out of the home to work at a time when workplaces largely lacked breastfeeding accommodation laws. The new law disproportionately affected black mothers. Black female welfare recipients were less likely to receive benefits under the new law than their white counterparts, and more likely to receive poor treatment from welfare agencies. An urgent need to work encouraged black mothers to abandon breastfeeding to avoid the difficulties and work-related problems it caused. In 1991, the WHO launched the Baby-Friendly Hospital Initiative to support hospitals in giving new mothers the necessary care and assistance to breastfeed their newborns. But medical officials prioritized hospitals in white neighborhoods for adopting baby-friendly practices, while largely bypassing hospitals in black neighborhoods. Instead, they pushed black women to breastfeed less. The racist legacy of coercive wet nursing during slavery has shaped every aspect of this landscape. It has fueled a combination of laws and racist stereotypes that pushed black mothers away from breastfeeding. The racial wealth gap, which is inextricably intertwined with the economic oppression of black Americans through laws and policies, forces new black mothers back to work earlier, making it harder for them to breastfeed because of inadequate support from employers. And all of this history continues to reverberate today. Freeman writes, "The negative effects of forced wet nursing during slavery have endured into the present. Some black women see breastfeeding as a way to take back the nutrients that were stolen from black women to feed black babies, but others refuse to breastfeed as a rejection of racist re-enslavement. Breastfeeding disparities are not the mere result of cultural preferences that education will dismantle. Instead, the racial gap in breastfeeding rates reflects white supremacy. Long-standing laws, policies, and oppressive behaviors created to intentionally uplift white mothers and babies while harming black mothers and babies." With many families scrambling for solutions to the U.S. formula shortage, stories of local women volunteering to serve as wet nurses have popped up around the internet, which raises the question, is wet nursing even a thing anymore? Turns out it is. While the profession of wet nursing is less common today thanks to modern alternatives like formula and breast milk banks, the informal practice of wet nursing, some say, is still alive and well. It just isn't talked about. In the U.S., there have been two main avenues of wet nursing. One, the profession of wet nursing has a long history of abuse and is bound by monetary exchange, or in the case of the antebellum South, the exploitation of enslaved black women who were forced to give their breast milk to white babies. The other form of wet nursing is more informal and takes place between family, friends, or other equals without uneven power dynamics. It's often unpaid and may also be referred to as cross-feeding or cross-nursing. Wet nursing and cross-feeding both involve the breastfeeding of a child by someone other than the mother. Wet nursing involves a woman who is not the social equal of the employer, is never reciprocal, and is normally for payment. Cross-feeding, also cross-nursing, is the informal sharing of breastfeeding between equals and is usually unpaid and may be reciprocal. Community attitudes in the late 20th and early 21st centuries are distrustful of this practice, though satisfaction is reported by the women involved in sharing breastfeeding. Still, Wolf says, not all early forms of wet nursing were nefarious. With no alternatives to breast milk, shared nursing was common, especially if a baby's mother died in childbirth or while the baby was still nursing. In that era, if a child didn't have access to human milk, the child died, Wolf says. So a lot of women out of generosity, whether they were a neighbor or a relative or a friend, would take a baby whose mother had died if they were lactating and breastfeed the baby alongside their own baby. In closing, while the act of nurturing another child can be seen as a form of care, the forced wet nursing of enslaved black women by their enslavers remains a stark reminder of the dehumanization, profound loss, and exploitation embedded in the institution of slavery. While nurturing the children of enslavers, these women were denied the fundamental right to care for their own. Their stolen mothering not only inflicted immediate pain but also cast a long shadow, contributing to the persisting racial disparities in breastfeeding practices and the complex relationship black communities have with this essential source of nourishment. We must acknowledge this painful history, not only to honor the resilience of these women, but also to understand how its legacy continues to shape our society today. As we acknowledge this tragedy, we must confront the legacy of slavery in all its forms and work towards a future where the sacred bond between mother and child is never again exploited or denied. That brings us to the end of this video segment, and if you did learn a thing or two, do not hesitate. Share your thoughts with us in the comment section below. We are always delighted to hear from you. Support our works also by hitting the like button of this video. Share with your families and friends to keep spreading our eye-opening black narrative.